Now we're moving to our discussion of Japanese women arriving in the late 1800s and the first half of the 20th century. And similar to the earlier Chinese women, the initial immigration of Japanese women arriving to America were very scarce in numbers. You see this highly imbalanced gender ratio. And indeed, according to U.S. immigration statistics, only 1,195 Japanese women arrived to the United States between the years of 1880 and 1900. Now, also similar to the earlier Chinese women, many of the Japanese women who initially arrived were also prostitutes. And they were also brought to the United States by this sort of slave trafficking system across the Pacific. And indeed, many of such women were abducted or deceived into coming to America with stories of riches that could be had in the United States. And once they were abducted, they were sold to this trafficker, and many had to be smuggled into the United States. Now, as opposed to the Chinese prostitution migration, when it came to the Japanese, you actually see the government keeping record of this. And indeed, the Japanese government was very concerned about Japanese American citizens in the United States, and we mentioned that in a previous lecture. And they were also aware of the prejudice that arose against the Chinese due to Chinese prostitution. So they felt that that similar sort of connection and resultant discrimination and prejudice would happen if you have this wave of Japanese prostitutes there arriving to the U.S. West. And they actually had a term for this in their records, the Japanese government. They called such women prostitutes senpu. Now, let's remember in the case of China, at that time, during the 19th century, China was an empire on the verge of collapse. And therefore, the Western powers, the Western empires, didn't really pay them any respect. And that's in stark contrast to Japan after the Meiji Restoration, the revolution to modernize and industrialize their country. So Japan was indeed a rising empire. In fact, it was in league with some of the great European empires by this time. Hence, Japan was very concerned about its national image before the rest of the world. And because of this, Japanese government officials were appalled at the arrival and presence of prostitutes in America due to what I just mentioned, right? That it would not only cause this stain on the national honor, right? But also they feared that it would lead to the Japanese in the United States as being a new form of, quote, yellow peril, right? This moral degeneration of America that's caused by, in this case, the Japanese. So indeed, they feared that the presence of such women would precipitate anti-Japanese sentiment. And of course, that happened earlier with the Chinese. So their fear was not unfounded. And therefore, you see quotes like this. This is a quote from the Japanese consulate regarding his worries over these waves of women who were prostitutes. Quote unquote, "If matters are left as they are today, illicit Japanese houses," and by the way, this is probably the brothels, right? "Illicit Japanese houses inevitably will be established soon all over the U.S. At present, the Japanese are prone to incur the enmity of Americans like the Chinese. If we allow the prostitutes to carry on unhindered, what will be unavoidable is that prostitution will become a basic pretext in the hands of Japanese exclusionists." So, again, not only a tarnish of their image, as I mentioned, but the fear was that it would trigger exclusion, because that's what happened earlier with the Chinese. Okay, but you do see the U.S. allow migration of Japanese women. And as I mentioned in a previous lecture, this was largely due to the Pitcher Bride system, as mentioned here. All right. And the Pitcher Bride system, let's recall what that was about. Here was a system whereby this largely gendered labor force of men arriving to the United States from Japan could begin to seek wives in their home country of Japan through this intermediary agency that would basically arrange marriages. And what they did is exchange photos of each person, and they arranged it that way. That's why, of course, they're called picture brides, because the Japanese men laboring on the West Coast only received photos. And so, too, of course, did the women only receive photographs of their would-be husband. Now, there are some interesting oral testimonies of the picture brides once they were interviewed or in their diaries, once those were discovered. Many of them were genuinely shocked, for example, to see their new husbands. Why? Because often the husbands would use early photos of them when they were much younger, and only to discover that their husbands were like in their 50s or even 60s, right? Some of the picture brides lamented the fact that they were marrying this quote unquote old man. And then once entering the United States, they usually wore their traditional Japanese clothing like kimonos and the sandals. But as part of their initiation into American society, it was common and expected, actually, to have their wives wear Western clothing. So, the husbands took them to the clothing store and they outfitted them with Western clothes. And again, in these oral testimonies, such women described how they could barely walk, in these constricting Western clothes. They had trouble breathing and walking in the pointed shoes that were around at this time. Okay, so interesting experience for these women who may have heard about what to expect, but once they experience it, they realize that there's such a different world for them, right? Now, in accordance with this practice, the majority of wives who entered immigrant society between 1910 and 1920 were indeed picture brides. And what's important about this is, as noted here, in terms of the implication for family formation and community, this allowed the family formation of Japanese Americans to begin apace here. And it also, however, led to vehement protest, emanating from nativist and anti-Asiatic groups, anti-Japanese groups. So hopefully it's readily apparent to you how the arrival of a significant number of women, and again, you have to compare it with the earlier Chinese example, and even compare it with the Manongs, the Filipinos arriving later after this period. So, in contrast, the Japanese picture bride system basically led to this presence of women, and the fear that was sparked by this was the notion of the Japanese becoming permanent settlers, right? And the presence of women basically enables Japanese families to form on U.S. soil. And at that time, it was inconceivable to have this critical mass of Asians or quote unquote Orientals in the United States. So indeed, nativists claimed that the picture bride system was the source of this, and they began to protest it. They claimed it was a violation of the earlier Gentleman's Agreement in 1906, which we discussed earlier. Now, to appease the agitators, the Japanese consul in San Francisco in 1919 recommended to the foreign ministry in Tokyo, Japan, that it suspend the issuance of the passports to the picture brides. All right. And why was this? Because they felt that, of course, if it continued, it's going to lead to even violence perpetrated against the Japanese in the United States. And as it would happen, the government in Japan agreed, and they suspended the issuance of these picture bride passports. So by 1920, there were no more passports issued to picture brides, and that led to the end of the picture bride system. But you have to think about this. As I just described it, there's already a formidable number of families, even after the picture bride system is abolished. And this would allow a significant number of Japanese American families to form, including, of course, their children, second generation. Let's remember that ever since the Wong Kim Ark case, Asians who were born in the United States were guaranteed citizenship through the 14th Amendment. Okay, so that's going to have huge implications, and it's also going to arouse the fear, anxiety, and hostility of the nativists, knowing that there's going to become this, again, formidable presence of Orientals who receive citizenship. Now, one thing we acknowledged earlier is the tendency of the Japanese Americans to acculturate and to even embrace assimilation compared to the earlier Chinese. That's not to say that there's no historical examples of Chinese that were unassimilated. Of course there were. But broadly speaking, the Japanese tended to accept modernization, accept acculturation, and so forth. And you can even see it in these photographs. Here's the Issei, as we know, as the first generation, and they're dressed in what was probably the fashion back then, you know, the hats and the clothing. And then the second generation, the Nisei, well, it's just like any second generation of Asian Americans today. You know, they look like any other American around, a young American, right? And of course, this is likely the fashion back then, and the hairstyle and the clothing and everything. And then there's the car in the back, probably 1930s or 40s. So there we go. It's kind of this example here that the Japanese are indeed assimilated to Western culture. Now, fast forward when we discuss World War II, well, we're going to see how even though they're assimilated and even though they proclaim loyalty to the United States, the Japanese will still be considered foreigners, unassimilated, and therefore after Pearl Harbor, they'll all be sent into these internment camps or concentration camps away from the West Coast.